I knocked on the back door of Evelyn's house just as the moon rose full and round, the way it always made Harold laugh. Like a ripe apple held up by the sky, he used to say. The porch light glared at me like something too bright for my old eyes, and when the door opened, she looked at me as if I had wandered in off the street. For a second I thought she didn't remember me, then her smile sharpened into something practiced and polite. "Mama," she said, but the word came out small, like a paper boat on a pond. I stood there with my chipped mug in my hand. The one with the tiny crack down the lip that Harold used to tease would give me a free bath someday if I ever dropped it. And the mason jar of pennies I'd brought, because that's what we did in my family. We kept little things with big meaning. I had walked from my car with the smell of coffee still warm in my nostrils and the shape of my pearls under my cardigan. The pearls were old. They'd belonged to my mother and then to me, and they felt heavy with years and promises. I'd brought them because Evelyn's son, my grandson, had been born earlier that day, and I wanted to watch him sleep and smell the hospital soap and tell him the stories of the full moons his grandfather used to mark. "Tonight's the family dinner," she said, and the words should have been an invitation. Instead, they shut like a lid. I started, and I could see, in the way her hand hovered near the doorframe, that she had rehearsed this. "We saved seats for you," she added, and I felt heat climb my neck that had nothing to do with the summer night. "I'll bring you some tea later," she said, and the door closed. I held the jar of pennies in my hands, and the moon looked at me as if it knew everything and had no intention of telling. The walk back to the car was short, but my heart had the weight of a long, slow storm. I thought of Harold in the garden, foraging at midnight with a flashlight and a trowel, his hands smelling of dirt and pipe tobacco. He used to hide jars under the lilac bush every full moon, not for superstition, but because he liked the quiet of the night and the small ritual of tucking something away, the way some people write in diaries and some people set aside a slice of pie for later. He used to whisper to me then, "If anything ever goes sideways, I don't want them finding everything in one place." He would pat my hand and grin, the moon crowning his bald head like an old halo. That habit of his, the jars, the moon, the small secret safekeeping, had been a joke between us. I remember the heft of the glass in my palm, the clink of coins, the little folded notes he'd slip inside sometimes, grocery lists, a joke, the date of our first slow dance. I used to keep the jars on the back porch until Harold would say, "No, it'll be safer under the rosemary." Sometimes the jars meant money, a few bills to cover a car repair or a dentist appointment. Other times they meant memory, a note to hold us steady. When Harold grew sick, he told me to hide one last jar for him. He wrote on a piece of paper in his crabbed handwriting, "April 3rd, for the baby, if he's ever born. If not, for you." He sealed the note and asked me to put it in a mason jar and plant it under the old apple tree. We buried it together under the moon that was as bright as a coin on April 3rd, the year before he died. He pressed his forehead to mine and said, "Promise me, Marge, don't sign anything without reading it." I promised him, and went on promising all the days after that. My ordinary world, before the moonlight turned strange, was small and honest. I lived in a one-story house with a porch swing that creaked like an old friend and a kettle that whistled sharp and fast when it was angry. My kitchen table had a ring stain from Harold's mug, a faint ghost of a coffee morning, and there was a shoebox of letters tied with twine under my bed. I had a dented pressure cooker and 2 good quilts. I also had Evelyn, who left for the city when she was 22 and returned with shoes that didn't belong on our gravel road and a laugh that sounded different. She'd always been clever, but clever in a way that made doors open for her. When my husband died, on a Tuesday in November, the doctors said they'd done all they could, and I believe that's true. Everything settled into new shapes like the way you rearrange furniture after a party. Evelyn came, of course, but she had a calendar of children and meetings and clients. She hugged me and left behind casseroles that tasted like someone else's recipe. She called less and less. Her house, that broad, white place with the marble steps and the big windows, had been paid for a while by her husband's business. And the family gatherings that used to be in our kitchen moved to her dining room because there were more chairs and plush carpeting where knees didn't complain. She told me once over the phone, "Mama, you're safer there. Closer to the doctor." I believed her the way you sometimes believe thunder in a clear sky, because the voice that says it belongs to your child. I knew, even then, that we were different kinds of people. Evelyn held her world like a ledger. Numbers, columns, neat, efficient. I held mine like a recipe, a pinch of this, a memory sprinkled in, a dash of forgiveness. But I had expected my place at the table to be a given. Mothers sit at tables. Mothers are the ones who bring the mason jars of pickles and the extra napkins. Mothers are the ones who know where the sugar is kept. The first betrayal didn't come as a shout. It came as a whisper that grew into a rumor. The first time I noticed something missing, it was small. A mason jar gone from the shed where Harold and I kept our winter bulbs and our spare screws. Harold had always joked that the shed held the answers to life if you could only look between the fertilizer and the broken shovel. When I opened the shed that morning, a Wednesday, April 10th, 2 days after the mayoral gala in town, I reached for the top shelf where a line of jars had long slept like bees in a comb, and there was a gap. One jar, the one with the blue lid that Harold had painted for me on our 50th anniversary, was gone. I didn't mention it to Evelyn. Who would I tell? I called my neighbor Jo, who always smelled of rose soap and knew everyone's business, and she told me not to fuss over small things. People take things, she said, but her voice went gentle, like a curtain falling. Maybe Harold moved it, but Harold was gone. I knew that with the same certainty, I had known the shape of his laugh. Then the invitations changed. The family pictures on holiday cards no longer included my name in the notes. They said, "With love," and signed Evelyn and family, and my name was an afterthought scribbled on the envelope, like it had been added later in pencil. The pearls felt heavier around my throat. Once at the grocery store, a woman I'd once babysat waved but then told her friend under her breath, "Isn't she?" And the rest of the sentence hovered in the air like a moth. My heart learned a new rhythm. Wait, listen. Don't make a scene. There were other small things. A letter from the bank with a stamp that read, "Account moved. Please verify," which I had to ask Jo to help me open because the letters seemed to have multiplied overnight. A phone call from a lawyer, in which the receptionist's voice was polite and then suddenly clipped. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, the mug sweating in my hands, reading a sentence I didn't understand. Durable power of attorney, executed March 29th. My handwriting trembled as I held the paper. I did not remember signing anything on March 29th. I called Evelyn then, voice small and brittle. "Oh, Mama," she said, with that infuriatingly careful tone. I had to make sure everything was in order for the house and the bills. We thought it prudent. Her voice suggested she'd saved me from a blizzard I never knew was coming. "You were exhausted. Ma, you should have rested." Her pause smelled like an excuse. I went to the assisted living meeting 2 weeks later because they insisted it would be safer for me, and my heart congealed like cold gravy as I sat there and listened. "It's for your own good," the nurse said, and a social worker who smelled of lemon and planner notebooks passed me a pamphlet. I thought of Harold's hands in the dirt and of the jar under the apple tree with his note. I thought of our promises on April 3rd. My hands shook so hard I almost spilled the coffee on my lap. A minute later, my daughter Evelyn signed a paper and put down a date, March 29th, with curly, confident handwriting. The nurse told me it was standard to have things assigned when memory becomes uncertain. Evelyn looked at me square in the eyes and said, "Mama, trust me." The first real breach of trust came in the mail in an envelope with the county clerk's stamp. It was a notice about a revision to beneficiary on a life insurance policy in Harold's name. Dated May the 2nd. Someone had changed the beneficiary from me to Evelyn Marlowe, full name, middle included, and signed it with a hand that looked like mine at a glance, but with a steadiness and a flourish I did not have anymore. The amount listed sat there in bold, and my stomach folded, about $230,000. It was more money than I'd ever seen at once, more than the mortgage on my little house if there had been one left. For a long time I stared at those numbers and thought maybe I had misread them. Maybe the clerk had sent the wrong envelope. But the dates stacked up like stepping stones, leading me somewhere I didn't want to go. I began to see patterns where before there were only small, annoying mistakes. The neighbor's watch stopped the day after my grandson's baptism, just as Evelyn's cousin mentioned needing a watch repaired. The gardener, a man who used to tend the hydrangeas and talk about his daughter in college, stopped coming by. The locks on my mailbox changed. "Who takes a lock from a mailbox?" I asked Jo that, and she shrugged like a woman who'd been taught early how to look away. The nights grew long. I found myself wandering the garden, where Harold's trowel still leaned against the shed, rusted and patient. The apple tree we had planted the year our first baby came home was fat with leaves and wound-in string lights that came on in the evening, the way Evelyn liked them, little polite orbs. Under that tree lay the jar we'd buried on April 3rd. I had gone down one morning to check, and the soil had been disturbed. Someone had dug a shallow hole and left a footprint that didn't belong to me or Harold. The jar itself, the one with my husband's favorite blue lid, had been moved. Not far, just enough to make me feel like wind had passed through the house. My neighbor Jo, always practical, suggested I get a camera. "It's the modern world," she said, and produced a dusty little camera from her tote bag like she'd always owned one. I set it up one night at the window, the way men used to put jam jars in a row to keep the peace. I thought the camera would keep a record. 2 nights later, when I checked, the camera had been unplugged. There was an empty trail through the grass. That same week, I found a scrap of paper in the sink drawer, a page from a legal form, maybe a copy. The words, "Durable Power of Attorney, March 29th" at the top, and a signature at the bottom that might have been mine. Or might have been a mimic of the way my granddaughter learned to write her name in bold at summer camp. I pressed the paper to my chest like one of the old hymnals we kept for visitors, and I remembered Harold's voice telling me to read before signing anything. I had promised him, "Don't sign without reading." When I told Evelyn I wanted to see the jar under the apple tree, she laughed, the kind of laugh I'd given when Harold once said he'd hidden a coin for me under the porch board. "Mama, enough with the jars. You're fixating on nothing." But her hands, when she drew them across her mouth, had the tell of someone smoothing a wrinkle out of a tablecloth. She was practiced at erasing imperfection. It was at the town's spring fair that I overheard a conversation that made my stomach drop like a stone. I had gone with Jo because she insisted I needed to feel the press of people, the cool paper napkins, and the smell of roasting corn, all the small comforts of a life I recognized. I sat on a bench and listened to a man in a suit boast about an estate plan that had changed in favorable ways. The woman beside him nodded and said, April 4th was an ideal time to finalize things. I didn't know what they meant, but the words tasted like pennies. I kept thinking of Harold's jars and how every full moon for 32 years he'd go out into the garden and hide one, like tucking away a piece of the sky for safekeeping. Sometimes there was a coin, sometimes a note. Once he'd buried a handful of plums to see if they'd grow into trees. He'd told our neighbors stories about it, and they'd laugh and shake their heads and call him eccentric. Now, eccentric felt like a word people used when they wanted to push away what they couldn't file neatly. Every small cut sharpened. The invitations I didn't receive turned into visits I wasn't invited to, then into conversations where my suggestions were ignored and later repeated by Evelyn as if they were hers. Mama said she liked that pattern, she would say, and I would watch the room swallow my contribution. My pearls felt like they belonged to someone else when the family picture would be framed without my face. The mason jar was no longer a quaint thing. It was a promise Harold had buried in the earth with his fingerprints on the clay and a note folded the way an old hand folds a letter at the corners. That night, under a sky so full of moon that the pond looked like silver left on a dresser, I walked out to the apple tree. The air smelled of lavender and something bitter, like burnt toast. I knelt on the grass and felt the cold of the soil through my cardigan. The place where Harold and I had dug was fresh soil again, loose and soft. The jar was half buried at the edge of the flower bed, lid off, a scrap of paper sticking out. I reached for it, and my fingers brushed the paper, and I saw, in a handwriting I recognized like the back of my own hand, the name Evelyn and a date, April 4th, and a note that said simply, "Handled." My breath went out of me like wind through a porch screen. "Du ma," like moral aside. There is a peculiar cruelty in learning that the hands which once tucked you in are the same hands that will fold you away when the ledger calls for it. Grief teaches us that promises are often soft as bread until someone decides otherwise. I held the paper in my palm, and for a moment the world split like a ripe peach. I could go back inside and wait for morning, when the reason would be explained away as a mistake. I could believe that perhaps Evelyn had done what she thought best. Or I could open the lid of the jar and look, and then I heard footsteps behind me. My heart pounded so loud I could hear the moon listening. Cliffhanger. The footsteps behind me were soft at first, like someone stepping through fallen leaves, and then they stopped close enough that I could hear a breath. I turned, clutching the scrap of paper Harold had once tucked away in a jar, and there she was, Evelyn, hands folded in a way I'd seen 1,000 times when she was a child waiting for a bedtime story. Her face wasn't the face of someone surprised to find me there. It was the face of someone who had expected I might be, and who had a script ready. "What are you doing out here, Mama?" she asked, voice the same measured tone that had shut so many of my questions down. The moon made her hair silver at the edges, and the yard light painted diamonds across her shoes. For a moment I thought of the times she had been small and scraped-kneed, and I wanted to fold her into myself the way you tuck a sweater around a sudden chill. Then I remembered the paper with "Handled April 4th" written on it, and the jar half buried at my feet. "I found this," I said. "It was in the jar Harold and I buried." I held out the scrap, and she looked at it the way a woman looks at an old receipt, with polite concern, but nothing that betrayed her hand in the matter. "Handled," she read aloud. "Oh, Mama, you and your jars." "The jar was for Harold's note," I said. "He wanted me to keep it. He asked me to promise not to sign anything without reading it." My voice felt like an old hinge, rusty and pulled too hard. "Do you know what 'handled' means when you put it on a paper that belonged to my husband?" Evelyn's smile was thin. "Handled things are handled. Mama, you don't need to worry." She reached toward me as if to take my hand, and I pulled back because the hand that touched me had been the same one that signed a durable power of attorney on March 29th and changed a beneficiary on May 2nd. Words that rearranged the foundation of my life. Words that moved $230,000 like so many chess pieces. My heart hammered against my ribs so loudly I thought the moon might hear it. "Who opened the safe deposit box at First County Bank on April 6th? I asked, surprising myself with the sharpness in my voice. I'd learned that sometimes in small towns the world rearranged itself quietly, with ledgers and signatures and backroom dealings instead of shouting. I had found out through a friend of Joe's who worked at the bank that someone had accessed box number 217 and withdrawn a large sum. The teller had said it was a family matter. The words tasted like pennies in my mouth then. Evelyn's fingers tightened on the scrap, and she swallowed. "Mama," she said, soft as a reprimand, "you shouldn't be down here at night. It's not safe." She left before I had an answer, like a woman excusing herself from a dinner she'd planned. I sat on the ground under the apple tree and let the dirt sift through my fingers. The scrap of paper had been folded little and worn at the edges, the way a note that's been read 100 times becomes soft. I thought of Harold pressing his forehead to mine the night he told me to promise him I'd read everything before signing. I thought of the mason jars, the ones he'd hidden like small reliquaries, and how each full moon had been a little ceremony of keeping. The next morning I woke early and made coffee so strong it scalded the roof of my mouth. And then I did what my bones told me to do. I moved. I called Jo and told her to come over. She arrived smelling of rose soap and cinnamon rolls, and she brought with her a little stack of intuition and a quiet willingness to march into town with me. We went first to the county clerk's office because I had to see the documents with my own eyes. The county clerk, a woman named Marlene who'd known me since Evelyn was a baby, sat behind a long counter and looked at me over her glasses with that particular mixture of sympathy and municipal responsibility that small-town clerks carry. "You can request certified copies." "Mrs. Marlowe," Marlene said, tapping the keyboard. "There's a fee." She handed me a form to fill out, and I felt the weight of paper like the weight of bricks. I asked for the durable power of attorney. The paperwork dated March 29th. "Yes, it's on file," Marlene said. Signed by you, notarized here in town. She printed a copy and slid it across the counter. The signature looked like mine at a glance, shaky in the places my hand shakes, with the loop I always make on the R. But there were differences in the pressure and the turn of the last letters. My stomach did something that felt like a small, rebellious animal. Was there a notary? I asked, touch on the word like a finger on a sore tooth. Yes, Marlene said. April 4th, actually. We have a temporary notary who helps out when the other's on vacation. Name's Baxter. She looked at me as if more questions would tire her. I requested a copy of the notary register. We sat at the corner table and looked at the log. Baxter's stamp was there with an ink that had faded, and beside it, a time that said 2:10 p.m. But the signatures in the notary book weren't mine. They were frantic and full, like someone had hurried and then made up for it with flourishes. The clerk's face softened when I asked whether forgeries were common. Not common, she said, but not unheard of. She recommended a small lawyer in town, Carla Jennings, who used to be a public defender and had the sort of stubbornness I'd admired in older sisters. Carla listened to me in her office, which smelled of coffee and paper and the kind of dust that gathers around truths waiting to be told. She asked for everything: the durable power of attorney, the beneficiary change, the bank records someone had gifted me copies of in secret. She studied the signatures with a headlamp and a magnifying glass and then said, "We need an expert signature analysis, and we need to get a temporary restraining order to stop any further transfers." I sat with my hands wrapped around my mug and thought of Harold's hands, the calluses where he held the spade, the scar from a farm accident long ago. "Do you think they can prove it?" I asked, because years teach you the edges of hope are sharp and you do not want to cut yourself on them. Carla's mouth pressed into a line. "If we can show the signature is forged, or that your consent was obtained by coercion, and if we can prove there were withdrawals from box number 217 that were not authorized by you, then yes. We can ask for an injunction and file a suit to contest the transfers." She named the steps in legal language that sounded like a map: forensic document examiner, subpoena for bank records, interrogatories, deposition. But we have to move fast. Money moves quicker than the law. I left Carla's office with a paper sack of legal hope and a list of things to do. First on the list, get the forensic analysis. Second, secure more documentary evidence. Third, find out who had last accessed the safe deposit box and why. Hunting for evidence felt like the sort of work Harold had loved. Quiet, meticulous, patient. I retraced the small eccentricities of our life together. I checked drawers and old coat pockets and the Bible under the bed. I went through the shoebox of letters and found one that made me sit down hard on the kitchen chair because my pulse thudded like a fist. It was Harold's handwriting. He didn't often write in his last months, but he'd left me a small note, folded twice. Inside, in his crabbed script, he'd written, "If they change things, Marge, go to box 217 at First County. Key in the icebox behind the third jar. Don't take it. Get a lawyer. April 3rd, promise." He'd signed it, and then, as if he'd thought the signature might be difficult for me to read, he'd added, "Call Carla Jennings if I'm gone." My hands were too old to be surprised by findable miracles, but there it was, the key. I'd kept it in the icebox for years, tucked inside a mayonnaise jar like a ridiculous relic. Married people do strange things to keep secrets, and Harold liked to laugh at how safe a key would be when tucked among frozen peas. I held the little brass tooth, and it felt like a small, sturdy answer. I drove it to the bank, heart rattling like a loose bolt. The bank smelled of polished wood and disinfectant, and the teller's eyes flicked over me with that mix of pity and procedure again. "You want to open box 217? She asked. "No, I want to see the records for who opened it," I said. On April 6th, her face shifted. "That requires a subpoena or proof of ownership, Mrs. Marlowe. You can request a certified copy of the log, but—" She tapped her keyboard and printed a report. "Here's the ledger." The page showed that box 217 had been accessed on April 6th at 10:22 a.m. by— My breath caught as I read the name— Evelyn Marlowe. It showed a withdrawal of $200,000. The number sat on the page like a weight. $200,000. The total in my head didn't add up. Where had it gone, and for what? The same bank had also received a wire transfer on April 7th from an LLC with a name I didn't recognize. Marlowe Holdings LLC, with an account registered to an address in the city where Evelyn lived. I remember the way the bank manager, a man with a suit that smelled faintly of cologne and the faint, empty calm of people who handle money for a living, suggested gently, "You should talk to Ms. Marlowe. Perhaps there was a misunderstanding." His voice wanted to put the whole thing back in a box, label it clerical and slide it onto a shelf. Meanwhile, Carla had already arranged for an expert to examine the signatures. The man who came, Dr. Harold Brenner, odd coincidence of a first name that felt like a nod from my late husband, was a soft-spoken man with a magnifying light and the patience of someone who untangles watches. He took my documents and called them exhibits in a way that made me feel like a legal relic. He studied the durable power of attorney, the certificate of beneficiary change, and the notary register. "There are indications of tracing," he said finally, tapping his pen against his bottom lip. "The flow of the lines suggests someone was copying your hand." He pointed to the way the ink pooled on the downstrokes and to the hesitation marks at the beginning of certain letters. "You mean forged?" I asked, and the word tasted both terrible and somehow precise. "Yes," he said. "It would be negligent to say anything less. But I'll prepare a full report. It'll take about 10 days to complete the analysis, but it will be clear." Carla's eyes lifted. 10 days is too long to wait. "Mrs. Marlowe, we'll file for an emergency injunction to halt. Transfers and freeze box. 217 while the analysis is completed." She explained the process of filing a petition for temporary, restraining order and emergency. Conservatorship to prevent further depletion of assets. It's not guaranteed, but it makes it harder for someone to move money out while the case is pending. I went home and sat at my kitchen table with the note Harold had left. The jar under the apple tree felt like a thin hinge between now and before. It had been a gesture of trust and a test of my memory. Put the key in the icebox where she won't look. Harold had thought of things I never would have, even now. He had the foresight of a man who knew the catalogue of people's small cruelties, Dumas-like moral aside. When the ledger of one's life is opened by strangers, one discovers how thin the paper of our promises can be, but also how stubbornly ink clings to truth when you scrape away the varnish. I told Carla that I wanted Evelyn confronted. She advised against a blustery meeting. "We need the courthouse, Mrs. Marlowe," she said. "We do this by law, not by theatrics. But I am not made entirely of courthouse procedures. I wanted my daughter to see the things she'd done and to feel, for one heartbeat, the weight of it." Still, I listened to Carla. We filed the emergency papers and I sat in the cold wood-paneled room of the courthouse while the clerk stamped forms and the bright light over the judges. Bench seemed to make everyone's eyes small. Judge Whitaker, a woman with short silver hair and a voice like a bell, read the emergency petition with a gravity I felt clench around my ribs. "Mrs. Marlowe," she said, looking at me over the papers, "do you understand what you are asking the court to do? To freeze assets and potentially remove a family member's authority?" "Yes," I said. "The courthouse smelled like old paper and lemon soap. I understand. We requested the temporary restraining order." I handed over the documents Carla had collected. The copy of the durable power of attorney, the beneficiary change notice of May 2nd, the bank ledger showing access to Box 217 on April 6th, Dr. Brenner's preliminary findings, and Harold's note with the key location. My hands were steady because they had held babies and coffins and everything in between. The judge took a long, quiet breath and then asked for Evelyn's counsel to be notified. "Counsel?" she repeated. "You are representing Ms. Marlowe?" There was shuffling in the room, and then, as if summoned by the gravity of the moment, Evelyn walked in with a man in a navy suit whose smile was the kind of smile manufactured in law offices, polite, confident, and trained to smooth edges. He introduced himself as Marcus Hale. He carried a briefcase and the sort of file I'd seen men parade about during PTA meetings in my younger days. He did not look surprised to see me. He looked as if he had expected this exact tableau. "Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice even, "my client will argue the actions were taken with full authority and for Mrs. Marlowe's benefit." He set a folder on the judge's desk with a flourish. That made my teeth ache. Evelyn's face was the face of someone who believed in destination rather than journey. "Mama," she said, and the word was soft in a way that felt newly learned. "I did this to protect you." We adjourned for an hour while the judge considered the preliminary materials. I walked out into the courthouse corridor and leaned against the cool marble. The smell of lemon and floor wax seemed to press into the bones of the building and make everyone polite. People moved around me like currents. I saw a clerk whisper to another clerk and someone else check a phone. In that hour, I felt small and very large all at once. Small because my life lay in papers and signatures. Large because I remembered raising a child who had once held my hand in the dark. When the judge returned, she called for a temporary injunction to freeze Box 217 and to restrain any transfers linked to the accounts identified in our petition, pending full hearing. She said the preliminary evidence suggested a serious question concerning the authorization and that the court would preserve the status quo until a complete examination can be made. Felt like a child saved from a fall. Carla squeezed my hand and I whispered, "Thank you," which felt too small. But then Marcus Hale asked the judge for a limited release to fulfill what he called immediate needs for Mrs. Marlowe, medical bills, home expenses, and he produced a list of invoices and a copy of what he said was a revocation form signed by Mrs. Marlowe. He said that some transfers were necessary to cover medical expenses and that Evelyn had acted in her mother's best interest. The judge, sensible and wary, said she would review any proposed disbursements under supervision. Outside the courtroom, Evelyn cornered me in the hallway, her voice quiet, and the way she spoke felt like a plea wrapped in a contract. "Mama, this will only make things harder," she said. "Everyone in town is whispering." I did what I thought best. "Harold was always worried about leaving you. I secured things so you would be cared for." She put a hand on my arm, which made me flinch even though I wanted to lean into the touch. "You moved $200,000 out of Box 217, I said. "You changed the beneficiary on Harold's life insurance to yourself. You had me sign a durable power of attorney on March 29th. Her eyes slid away. "You signed," she said. "You were not in your best. You told me to handle things. You told me to trust you," I interrupted, remembering the way her voice could be a warm blanket. "You said it was for my good. Dumas-like moral aside, children sometimes learn currency before conscience, and husbands teach us how to bury a thing like hope. But justice, when it comes, is patient enough to find both the grave and the gardener." The judge set a hearing date for 2 weeks out. The forensic report would take 10 days. Carla and Dr. Brenner both told me to prepare for a long, slow grind. The town would watch. Evelyn's friends would pick sides. The papers would write a version of the story. I would have to tell the true version. At night, the house felt like a stage. I slept poorly, and in the small hours I would wake with the taste of dust and court ink in my mouth. Jo brought over casseroles and sat with me and folded laundry like a ritual. She was the sort of friend who made silence feel like company. She held my hand without questions and told me that Harold would be proud. I began to notice small betrayals turning into brash attempts at erasure. Family photos that had once hung in frames started to be replaced with new ones, where Evelyn's children were prominent and my face was a shadow at the edge. A letter from the social worker suggesting placement in a monitored community arrived with a postscript from Evelyn, recommending safety measures. The nurse who once came to check my blood pressure began scheduling appointments that required me to be at a facility for assessment. It felt like the world kept moving me into boxes while claiming it did so for my own protection. Protection, as I was learning, is sometimes a hand that pushes a person out of a doorway and locks it behind them. Then, on the morning Dr. Brenner called to say his preliminary report had enough to support probable cause for signature forgery, Evelyn's husband, her ex, who had been conspicuously absent from our dramas, posted a public notice on a neighborhood forum. "Please respect Evelyn's family privacy during these trying times." It was a small thing, a polite plea for discretion, but in the language of our town, it was a rallying cry. People who had not spoken to me in years commented with hearts and little emojis, and a few called me to say they were saddened by the public nature of our dispute. The court papers were public record. Gossip is relentless and prefers scandal to slow truth. Carla laid out our case for the big day. We'll subpoena bank records, notary records, phone records, and any surveillance footage from First County Bank. We'll issue interrogatories to Evelyn and request depositions. We'll bring Dr. Brenner as an expert witness. She spoke like a conductor assembling an orchestra to play a symphony of proofs. I wanted to tank the orchestra with my bare hands and show them the music. I wanted to go to Evelyn's house and demand the truth aloud. But we had a different weapon: the law. It was clunky and slow, but it had teeth. Carla filed the subpoenas and we waited. On the morning of the hearing, the courthouse felt impossibly full. People lined the benches like a small town assembly. I could hear the scrape of shoes and the shuffle of papers. Carla wore a navy suit and looked like the map of our intentions. Marcus Hale smiled with the kind of confidence that sticks to a person like glue. Evelyn sat beside him with her chin lifted and her hands folded. She looked like the portrait in a family album, polished and carefully lit. When the clerk called the case, Marcus rose and began to speak for Evelyn. He told the judge, in a voice designed to be reasonable, that the actions were done in good faith. Then he produced a packet of documents: a resignation of the durable power of attorney, a signed affidavit from a doctor asserting that I had diminished capacity on March 29th, and a set of invoices covering medical and caregiving expenses. The affidavit had a date and a signature. The doctor's letter said that I had been disoriented on the date in question and that Evelyn had acted to protect my interests. Carla's eyebrows rose. "We will request the doctor be produced for deposition," she said, and the judge made a note. Marcus moved on, confident. Then Carla called Dr. Brenner to the stand, and he explained his findings with patience and a slow exactness that made hair stand up on the back of my neck. He pointed to differences in ink flow and pressure and explained the concept of tracing and simulation. He said the analysis suggested the signature was likely traced or copied. "But likely isn't proof," Marcus objected. "We cannot rely on subjective analysis." Then, Carla said, "We have bank records showing the withdrawal from Box 217 on April 6th by Ms. Marlowe, and we have a note from Harold Marlowe, dated April 3rd, referencing Box 217 and suggesting Mrs. Marlowe contact Ms. Jennings if anything is amiss." Marcus shifted uneasily. He had no immediate answer for a note written by a man no longer here to speak. The judge listened, her fingers steepled. Just as the court clock ticked toward noon, my phone buzzed with a number I knew. It was Jo, frantic. "You need to come home," she said. "Now." My stomach dropped and my knees felt like they had washed away in warm water. I excused myself and ran out of the courtroom, out into the sunlight, and drove, hands white on the steering wheel, back to my house. When I pulled up to my porch, there was a piece of paper taped to my front door. It read, in block letters, "We can make this easier." Underneath, someone had drawn a small circle and written April 4th in the center. The smell of summer made the paper curl. My hands felt numb. I opened the door and felt the house breathe out something like a held note. The photograph, on the mantel of Harold and me at our wedding, had been turned face down. The jars in the shed were all there, except one, the blue-lidded jar that had meant the world to me. In its place lay a small velvet pouch. Inside the pouch was a single pearl from my necklace. My breath left me in a little sound. The phone rang again. It was the judge's office, calling to say that a new motion had been filed, asking the court to reconsider the temporary injunction based on newly submitted evidence of my incapacity. Marcus Hale's file had a new affidavit attached, a video, recording of a short interaction from March 29th, taken, they claimed, by a visiting nurse's tablet, in which my voice sounded confused. The prosecutor at the courthouse said it was enough to ask for a competency evaluation. Carla looked at me then with tired, honest eyes. "They're going to try to paint you as incapable," she said. "They'll argue that you weren't in a position to consent, They'll argue you needed protection and Evelyn provided it. They'll be aggressive. My hands, which had once held newborns and baby teeth and wedding bouquets, trembled. The world had narrowed to the single line. Would the court see a woman who had held a marriage for 50 years, who had hidden keys in jam jars and planted notes in the ground? Or would it see a feeble old woman whose signature could be imitated by a practiced hand? I thought of Harold's laugh, the way he'd say, "Marge, fight like a woman with a stubborn cat." I thought of the mason jars and the moon. I thought of the little boy who would grow up and perhaps one day learn the story if I did nothing. I thought of dignity as not a thing given, but a thing reclaimed. This was the moment, the point of no return. There would be no simply putting the lid back on, no pretending the soil had never been turned. I had to move, not with the fury of a woman with nothing to lose, but with the careful, stubborn calculation of someone who had a ledger of promises and a note from a dying man. Dumas-like moral aside, in the ledger of life, we are all creditor and debtor. Kindness collects interest, and betrayal calls for an accounting. I walked back into the courtroom that afternoon with the velvet pouch in my bag and the note from Harold folded in my hand. The judge looked at me with a gaze that asked whether I knew what I sought. I could feel every eye in the room press on me like small coins. Marcus Hale rose and said, "Your Honor, in light of this new evidence of Mrs. Marlowe's incapacity, we request an immediate competency evaluation and suspension of guardianship proceedings." Carla objected and asked for a hearing, for time to produce Dr. Brenner's final report, and to depose the witnesses Marcus presented. The judge's gavel came down like a small thunderclap. She ordered a panel to assess competency, and she delayed any decision on full guardianship pending the assessments. She kept the temporary freeze on Box 217, but allowed for supervised disbursements under court oversight, enough, perhaps, to pay a few bills and keep my utilities on. It felt like partial victory and partial exile. But as I walked out of the courtroom that day, someone yelled my name. Evelyn stood at the top of the courthouse steps, her hair pinned and her face set. She raised a hand, and for a moment I thought she might come down the steps and embrace me or fall at my feet. Instead, she opened her mouth and said, loud enough, "For everyone to hear, you have no idea what it is to carry the weight of ensuring someone's care." Her voice was like a bell, half indignation, half command. The town watched. The family watched. The jars in the shed seemed to rattle. Cliffhanger. The weeks that followed felt like walking through a house full of doors that weren't mine to open. Each morning, the sun slid over the porch, and I would make coffee, the mug that still had the tiny crack in its lip, and try to set the world to right by folding a towel or feeding the cat. But the house around me had changed its bearings. The phone rang with court dates, and the mail came heavy with subpoenas. And in the corners where Harold's tools once rested, there were stacks of documents that smelled faintly of toner and possibility. The competency panel came first. They sent a doctor who wore a tie that somehow made him look like he was trying to be friendly to everything. He asked me questions that sounded like little pebbles tossed into a pond. "What year is it? Who is the president? Can you recall a recent event?" I told him about Harold's jars, and about the way he used to whistle with his mouth full of pipe tobacco, and the way the moon used to press itself against our window. I told him the story of April 3rd when we buried the jar under the apple tree. I remember his pen pausing when I mentioned Harold's note. The doctor's eyes softened at the parts where memory was a lantern I could hold up and show. In the end, he filled out his form and wrote words that, for once, felt like they were on my side. No signs of significant cognitive impairment affecting ability to understand and express intent. He dated it May 22nd and signed with a flourish. It felt like a small, necessary amnesty. Carla moved like a woman who'd learned how to make mountains into mailboxes. She filed our motions, chased the bank's compliance officer, and produced a subpoena for surveillance footage from First County Bank. The bank, after an internal review, produced tapes from April 6th. The start of the footage showed a woman entering the bank at 10:15 a.m. She looked familiar to me even though the frame was grainy. the way she carried herself before the camera. Knew her was the same way she'd once walked into a hospital room to hold my hand. Then, at 10:22, the video caught her alone at the counter, signing a ledger and walking out with a bank envelope. The caption over the clip read, "Withdrawn, Box 217, authorized by Evelyn Marlowe." There was a time code, and the date was clear. Marcus Hale's confident smile in the courtroom that day felt like a mask that had cracked. We got Dr. Brenner's final report in an email that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand to attention. He explained, with diagrams and patience, that the signature on the durable power of attorney bore traces of tracing and simulation. There is evidence consistent with an individual reproducing the form of the signature, likely by copying, he wrote. He called it forensic indicators, suggesting a non-genuine signature. Carla read the report with a steady face and then tucked it into her briefcase like a talisman. We deposed the visiting nurse whose tablet had supposedly recorded the March 29th interaction. The woman, who'd been named in the affidavit Marcus produced in court, was small and jittery under Carla's questions. We asked about the video's metadata and the logs at the clinic. She stammered. I only recorded it because the doctor asked me to note her confusion. When pressed, she admitted the footage had been transferred via a flash drive that had no chain of custody documentation. "I put the file on a thumb drive and sent it to Ms. Marlowe's daughter," she said, and then her voice dropped to a pinched whisper. "I was told it was urgent." Carla's eyes narrowed. "Who told you it was urgent?" The nurse hesitated and then said a name Marcus didn't want mentioned, Evelyn Marlowe. Evidence kept brightening corners we'd once only guessed at. The bank's internal review showed a wire transfer on April 7th to Marlowe Holdings LLC for $150,000, labeled investment. The entity was registered to an address in a building where Evelyn had an office suite. The registration records, obtained by subpoena, listed Evelyn as an officer. The remainder of the $200,000, withdrawn from Box 217, when matched against bills and credit statements we subpoenaed, had been used to pay down a line of credit on Evelyn's townhouse and to pay invoices for interior renovations at her property. Receipts bore her signature and an address I recognized from her business card. I remember holding those pages in my hands and feeling the world tilt in a way that made me steadier. It was a strange thing to be relieved that money had a trail. Money, after all, does not argue. The money had feet, and it had walked straight into Evelyn's life. Then there was the letter from the life insurance carrier. The beneficial change, the one that had switched Harold's $230,000 policy to Evelyn on May 2nd, had been flagged by the company's fraud department after our complaint. They sent us an internal memo explaining that the change of beneficiary form had signatures inconsistent with their files and that the payment would be frozen pending investigation. The company had a duty to the insured, Harold's policy, and to the rightful beneficiary. When I saw that memo, I felt relieved in the way you feel when a gate finally, at last, closes behind you. Carla prepared the motion to ask the court to rescind all changes made to beneficiaries and to revoke the durable power of attorney dated March 29th on the basis of forgery and coercion. Marcus filed counter-motions naturally, arguing that Evelyn had acted for my benefit and that any discrepancies were clerical. He was persuasive to some ears, which made my chest ache the way a rainstorm aches at an old tin roof. We were scheduled for the big hearing on June 18th. Which felt like a date circled in a calendar with a pencil rather than ink. Tentative, but telling. Carla and I rehearsed like women practicing for a harvest. She told me exactly what to say, which requests to avoid, and how to sit so the judge could see that I was, indeed, me. Not a story to be swept aside, but a person who had lived and kept promises. Dumas-like moral aside. When the truth comes, it is less like a bolt of lightning and more like an old friend who knocks until you answer. It does not demand grace, it demands attention. The morning of June 18th, the day was a clear, pearled thing. I dressed in my plain blue dress that Harold had always liked and the pearls he had once teased me about because they clacked when I leaned forward. The jars in the shed seemed to creak in agreement as I locked the door. Jo drove me because she said the radio made her nervous and her hands were seldom still. We arrived early and the court clerk handed us a packet. People from the town had come, some wearing small, tentative smiles, others with the sour curiosity of bees. Marcus Hale started with a practiced flourish, calling witnesses who testified about my diminished capacity and the necessity of swift action. Then Carla walked to the bench and did what she does best. She stitched the paper trail into a story. She called Dr. Brenner and asked him to explain the indicators he'd found. He did so, with diagrams and patience, and the judge, a woman who had weathered the motions of many a small-town tempest, leaned forward, interested. We called the bank's compliance officer. She brought the surveillance footage and explained the wire transfer. When she said the name on Box 217's access log was listed as Evelyn Marlowe and that a bank teller had witnessed the withdrawal, I felt something like ice run down my spine. Marcus objected. "Witnessed how?" he demanded. The compliance officer answered that the teller had signed a form acknowledging the withdrawal and that a security printout matched the teller's name. Could the teller have been mistaken? Marcus asked. The compliance officer hesitated and then said the bank was confident. Their records were accurate, their timestamps precise. Carla asked the court to admit the April 6th surveillance footage into evidence. Marcus tried to object on privacy grounds. The judge considered and then said, "This is a claim of wrongdoing. The footage is relevant." The clip played, and the grainy image of Evelyn at the counter was on the big courtroom screen. You could see the way she reached for an envelope and walked out. The courtroom air tightened like an overfull kettle. Then came the testimony that shook the air. The visiting nurse, the one who'd handed the tablet video into Marcus's folder, took the stand. Carla asked her under oath, "Did you produce the tablet footage directly to Evelyn Marlowe or to the clinic's record system?" The nurse's voice was small, and for a moment I thought she might cry. "Ms. Marlowe asked me to send the file to her daughter," she said. "I thought I was helping. Did anyone else give you instruction to alter or edit the footage?" Carla asked. The nurse broke. "There was an email," she said. She swiveled her head and looked at Marcus Hale and then at Evelyn, who seemed suddenly very still. "There was an email from Ms. Marlowe saying, 'Make sure we have something to show them.' I didn't know what she meant at the time." Marcus opened his mouth and then closed it. Evelyn's face went pale as flour. Evidence mounts like winter wood when you let it pile and stack. It does not fall down easily. The judge listened to the nurse's testimony and then, with a voice like a bell that will not be rung again lightly, said she would hold an evidentiary hearing to evaluate the authenticity of the video and the metadata. The metadata from the tablet, which an expert we'd subpoenaed analyzed, showed the file had been altered, timestamps changed, edits made. The chain of custody was interrupted. The file had been copied and sent via a thumb drive without clinic logs. In the end, the judge found that the affidavit Marcus had offered, based on the doctored video, carried little weight, but the story had teeth yet to bite. We still needed to show the signature was forged and that funds were transferred to an entity that benefited Evelyn. Carla called the bank's records manager and laid out the ledger of transfers. She asked for the trace of the $150,000 wire to Marlowe Holdings, LLC. The bank's tracing showed the funds had cleared into an account at a brokerage tied to Evelyn's company. We subpoenaed that brokerage and obtained records that showed a chain, $150,000 from Box 217 to Marlowe Holdings on April 7th, then an immediate $100,000 to a contractor named Stone & Cummernors for interior remodels at Evelyn's townhouse, and $50,000 to a home furnishing store. The final $25,000 was used to pay down credit lines. The paper trail smelled like varnish and new paint. I remember the moment the contractor's receipt came into evidence. It was a handwritten invoice for $100,000 for kitchen, bath, structural enhancement, dated April 10th. It was stamped and signed and had a phone number on it that connected to a woman who testified that she never did the work she billed for. She'd been paid, she said, by a check that later bounced, and the rest had been covered with the funds Evelyn had forwarded. The contractor looked at the judge with plain, small eyes and said, "I did my estimates, but the work was never fully completed." The judge's face tightened. The final blow came when Marcus's cushion of confidence slowly deflated. Carla asked for one last document, one we'd only found in a dusty corner of the county clerk's office. A notary stamp log for the temporary notary. Mr. Baxter. He'd been gone on April 4th, records showed, on leave for a family funeral. The notary stamp had been used in his absence and the log entry was backdated. How it had happened was a tangle of small deceptions. Someone at the clerk's office had later stamped the file to make it look there had been a notary present. It was sloppy. It had been hurried. Who had motive? The judge asked quietly, as if the answer was heavy and needed to be spoken in small doses. The motive, when it finally lay on the table, smelled like fear and greed and the small, sharp taste of entitlement. Evelyn had been listed as a beneficiary. She'd opened the safe deposit box on the pretense of assistance. She'd moved money into an LLC she controlled. And she'd presented evidence, doctored and forged, to support her position. The judge's face softened, not with mercy, but with the clear-eyed interest of someone who sees both law and human frailty. When she issued her ruling, it came in pieces that settled into place like a careful quilt. She found probable cause to rescind the changes to Harold's life insurance beneficiary on the grounds of fraud and forgery. She ordered the reversal of the change, and the insurer complied to hold the funds pending criminal investigation. She found that the durable power of attorney dated March 29th bore indications of forgery and revoked it. She ordered the bank to reverse the transfer from Box 217 as much as possible and to restore funds to a court-controlled escrow pending restitution. She appointed a neutral conservator to oversee my finances temporarily, not Evelyn, and ordered an audit of transfers made out of my accounts dating back 6 months, and, importantly, she referred the matter to the county prosecutor for criminal investigation into allegations of elder financial abuse and forgery. Marcus looked as if he'd swallowed something bitter. Evelyn's shoulders slumped, as if she carried not just the legal weight of her deeds, but the social weight that had been piling up for months. The judge's final words were spare and sharp. "There will be consequences for actions taken in bad faith," she said. Dumas-like moral aside, when law and conscience meet, the latter often limps, but it does arrive. Truth is not poetic because it is swift, but because it is inevitable. There was a hush as people in the gallery shuffled like leaves. I felt, for the first time in months, a tide ease. The jars in the shed seemed to vibrate in time with my heartbeat, as if they, and the small faithful things Harold and I had kept, were part of the verdict's music. But the court could not fix everything at once. The bank could only reverse what it could trace. Some funds had been spent legitimately on renovation invoices, and certain payments could not be fully recovered immediately. The insurer held the $230,000 life policy in suspense and promised to cooperate with the prosecutor. The judge ordered restitution and penalties that would be decided in follow-up proceedings, and the prosecutor's office moved to open a criminal inquiry for charges that could include forgery, theft, and elder financial abuse. There would be a criminal case. There would be depositions and hearings and perhaps plea talks or trial. Outside the courthouse, the town watched as if it were the last chapter of a long novel. People who had whispered now spoke in less hushed tones. Some came to my side to say sorry, others to offer words of support that felt like bandages over old bruises. Evelyn did not approach me. She left the courthouse with Marcus Hale and a look that had emptied out of it. The social consequences that followed were plain and human. Invitations evaporated. The country club, where Evelyn's friends met for luncheons, sent a polite note saying they were deeply concerned and had temporarily postponed her membership case. The church ladies who used to smile as she walked by now averted their gaze. Her ex-husband's polite note on the neighborhood forum turned to silence and then to a short, curt message that she had personal matters to address. Friends who had once toasted her in polite tones now sent uneasy texts that asked whether I was okay. It was absurd and satisfying all at once. The real humiliation, though, came when she had to face clients who had entrusted their money to Marlowe Holdings, LLC. Some demanded refunds, some left. Reputation, like a quilt, can be rewoven, but not without visible seams. In the weeks after the ruling, I gathered the scattered things of my life and put them in order. The pearls that had been in the velvet pouch returned to my neck. They had been placed there by an anonymous hand with a note. For the woman who remembers. The mason jar with Harold's note was returned to me as part of the evidence release. The judge, in her wisdom, said the jar was a sentimental item and should be restored. I held it to my chest and felt the hollow space where grief had lived begin to fill with something like peace. The most restorative moment came quietly. My grandson, the one Harold and I had hoped would know the story of the jars, came by with his mother and his small, warm hand. He sat on my lap and asked about the moon and why Grandpa had liked to bury jars. I told him, and he listened with the seriousness of a child learning a poem. I gave him one small jar, not one of the ones that had been entangled in the law, but a new one with a blue lid painted by me. Inside I put one of Harold's folded notes and a coin. When you're older, I told him, bury this on a full moon and tuck something you love inside. Promise me you'll read what's there before you sign anything. He promised. Solemn as a judge's clerk, Dumas like moral aside, the small rituals we keep, a jar, a note, a promise, are more than superstition. They are the architecture of memory, and memory is often the strongest defense against being undone. The criminal inquiry moved forward. Evelyn was charged with forgery and elder financial abuse. The prosecutor's office, after reviewing our evidence, filed charges that resulted in plea negotiations. Marcus Hale's law firm distanced itself from certain actions, and his reputation in town cooled. Evelyn, faced with the prospect of trial and the public airing of more private details, entered into a plea agreement for a reduced charge in exchange for restitution and community service. She admitted to certain acts in exchange for leniency. The judge, in sentencing, ordered restitution of $175,000 to be paid into a court-managed escrow for my benefit, community service work focusing on elder advocacy, and ordered that she undergo a financial management course. The life insurance policy was restored to my name as beneficiary, and the durable power of attorney from March 29th was formally annulled as forged. It was not a perfect justice. Some of the money could not be recovered immediately. Contractors disputed invoices, and some checks had been spent in ways that could not be fully unwound. But the law had recognized that a wrong had occurred, and there would be payments and penalties and a clear record. That mattered. It mattered in a way that was practical, and also in a way that warmed the ribcage like sunlight on a cold morning. People asked me later if I forgave Evelyn. Forgiveness is not a light thing. It is a practical garment you put on when you no longer wish to be chained to the one who hurt you. I forgave slowly, in pieces. When she came to the house one afternoon and stood on the porch like someone who had lost the script to a play she'd written. When she spoke my name and there was something like apology in the syllables. When she promised, in a small, humble voice, to make restitution beyond the court's order. I forgave because staying angry would have been letting her keep the better part of me. Forgiveness did not restore what had been done, but it made room for something else. My life. I reclaimed things too. The court appointed a neutral conservator to help manage my finances while the dust settled, someone with a steady hand who believed in ledgers and kindness. We set up a trust account into which the restored funds would be placed, and a small sum was released to ensure my household and medical expenses were paid. Carla stayed by my side, the way some people keep a lantern under a dark stair. She smiled once and said, "You did this. You kept your promise to Harold. I still keep that blue-lidded jar on the mantel. Its glass catches the afternoon like a little sun. Sometimes I take down the jar and read Harold's note and remember the warmth of his face and the way his hands smelled of soil and pipe tobacco. Sometimes I sit on the porch and listen to the night and think of the moon glow he loved. People in town, especially those who are older and have hands that remember how to sew and hands that remember loss, have come to sit on my porch. We talk about small things, and we give each other recipes and tips for how to keep roses alive. And we talk about rights, financial rights, the right to be heard, the right not to be spoken for without consent. The jars, Harold's habit, became a symbol not of secrecy, but of wisdom. The mason jar on my mantel now holds a folded list of things I want my grandson to have when he's older. My recipe for apple pie, a note about how to fix a leaky tap, the story of Harold hiding jars, and the lesson to always read a paper before signing. I suppose it's a small legacy, but it's honest. Poetic justice, in the end, was not a dramatic downfall with trumpets. It was a steady reclaiming, the rescission of forged papers, the reversal of a beneficiary change, restitution ordered in court, and a criminal record that would follow Evelyn the rest of her days. Her social standing frayed, her company disintegrated into the business equivalent of a cautionary tale. For her, the losing was public and hard. For me, the winning was quieter and steadier. The paperwork that said I was recognized. The law's ink that said I was wronged and that wrong would not stand. On certain nights, when the moon is full and round like a coin on the dresser, I go out to the apple tree and put my hand to the soil over where Harold and I buried that first jar. I feel the cool damp and remember his laugh. The world is a mixture of tenderness and sharpness. We learn to tend to both. I lifted my grandson up once, right there, and told him why men and women sometimes leave little things for the ones they love. He listened with the solemn face of someone who had been told something true. If my story touched you, share it with someone who needs courage today. And don't forget to subscribe. This old heart has many more truths yet to tell.